Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Chris McLeese. I am the sales director for Windward in Dubai. Today, we are going to talk about deceptive shipping practices, their implications, what they are, what this means to you. I'm joined today by CEO and founder of Windward, Ami. Hi, Ami. And also joining us is Neil Esart, lead regulatory and investigations advisor at Clyde & Company. Neil, I hope I got your job title correct.
That's perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, good. So thanks for joining. We'll kick off just a couple of things on housekeeping for everyone that's here. If you can just go on mute, we'll keep questions and answers to the end. If you have any questions and answers, please write them in the chat. We'll try and get to them as quickly as possible. We have the best people here to answer them. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about deceptive shipping practices, what the impact is on them for banks in the GCC. I guess to kick off, if we look at developments over the past couple of years, it's a topic that's gaining a lot of movement. And I guess we can expect a lot more to come. Ami, do you want to tell us just what you've seen in the last few years in the regulatory space?
Sure. So hi, Chris, and hi, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here. So if I take a step back, actually, everything shipping and trading was considered quite the Wild West until recently, and maybe still is. So from a regulatory perspective, actually trade-based money laundering, as well as sanctions compliance and counterterrorism and financial crime are all very well known, but not very well investigated and understood in the regards of shipping and trading. So I think compliance is absolutely the key driver here, just because it's very well structured. At the same time, when you speak to the world leaders on every one of these subjects, they oftentimes feel in the dark for what's happening in shipping and trading. So specifically, and weirdly, actually, the world leaders and thought leaders in this area are the United Nations panel of experts on DPRK. Originally, there was one on Iran as well, but it was disassembled when the GCPOA was effectively canceled by the US. When it was signed, but then effectively canceled by the US. And they coined the term deceptive shipping practices, which is, in other words, ways to circumvent sanctions via the ocean. So North Korea could not import coal, for instance, and other things, and they found a way to do that via ships. And then actually we saw the United States OFAC in 2019 take that into account and mention that, but officially the axe was drawn, so to speak, in May 2020 when OFAC in the US, as well as the UK OFSI, adopted this. So from sanctions perspective, this is really a year and a bit old, maybe a year and a half old almost now, and is driven by both the US, the UN, and the UK as a new bar to meet. And that new bar, just to be clear, first and foremost is relevant to regulated organizations, as well as it's very specific. So these deceptive shipping practices, what does it mean in practice? Let's take an example. So if you guys are financing either a ship financing deal, what's called S&P, sales and purchase, or a trade financing deal, you're expected to go about a year in the past, some would say until May 2020, and check these specific things. Have one of these vessels, which you might or might not know who they are, but you're expected to know, disabled their transmission system called AIS, have done ship-to-ship transfers, voyage irregularities, and so on and so forth. And you're expected to check that as fast as possible, and you could block that deal in real time, like some of the world leaders are thinking about doing. Or also in hindsight, when your trade operations team is still financing that and it's still taking time because it could take a couple months, as you know, to deliver a cargo, could be reporting that as a SAR, as a high-risk transaction. Does that make sense, Chris, as an overview?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how it continues to evolve and change, and deceptive shipping practices, it moves forward, is constantly evolving, and we'll talk more about that later. But I think a lot of deceptive shipping focuses on behaviors at sea, and I think and I'll ask Neil actually a little bit more. We know what the deceptive shipping practices are, things like disabling AIS, monitoring ship-to-ship transfers, and there's a reason why OFAC, OFSI actually have highlighted these activities as high risk. OFAC, OFSI, they're not trying to give people a hard time for no reason, is what I'm trying to say. There's an actual reason behind this, whether it be money laundering. Neil, just from your expertise, your experience at a high level, the behaviors that are identified, what typically can they represent in like in a financial crime perspective, say?
Yeah, you're right to suggest that it's not just sanctions evasion, although that's a very important and highly focused upon area. But there's also another range of criminal activities that a ship or a vessel seeking to deceive in relation to its location. So, I mean, if you start with very basic, human trafficking, drug trafficking, smuggling narcotics. Increasingly, the ESG agenda plays into that. So, it could be transportation of illegal logging or waste or fish. And by the way, I read recently that Interpol estimated that 20% of all the world's fishing is as a result of illegal fishing. So that's a huge number. About 48 billion US dollars in my calculations. But there's a whole range of issues. And if you look at trade-based money laundering, which Amy mentioned a few minutes ago, the reason that this is so attractive to criminals and organized criminality is that you can take place in a high value transaction on a single occasion. It's a process that is largely paper-based, it's complex, it's all the ideal ingredients to have a really low risk criminal activity. So it's really important to identify any indicators you can, and deceptive shipping indicators are one of the best clues that we've got in this space.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think it's interesting when you talk to bankers, particularly about trade-based money laundering, they look for a solution, but typically they're always looking for red flags. And I think we can talk more about this, more about kind of the guidance that's been issued recently in the UK around monitoring vessels and the behaviours of vessels as almost the tip of the iceberg in the trade-based money laundering side of things. Just moving on, when we look at the kind of the world of maritime, there's about 100,000 vessels at sea. Potentially all of these can pose a risk to banks. Banks typically monitor customers, and they have processes and procedures and tools to monitor high risk clients. We'll talk more on this, but we'll dig into it a little bit deeper in a couple of slides time. But we'll talk about kind of how to monitor vessels, best practice approach, and Amy, we'll go to you on that as an expert in later down the line. When it comes to kind of the maturity of financial institutions, Amy, I know you've done some work on this recently, and we have some numbers and stats to talk about with that.
Sure, happy to. So I think in this case, the right way for banks to think about this is that looking at vessels operations is actually looking at the reality of the world. It's very simple. You're financing assets and you want to make sure that these assets are doing what they're told. Think of it as getting an SMS from your government if you're supposed to be in quarantine or not, and being tracked on your phone. Maybe it's a better analogy. So I think what we've seen is it's just good for business, because if you would see the commodity trading area, there's been a lot of fraud, and actually, a lot of people in the industry are still trying to understand what to do with it. So maybe this coincides also with the adoption of AI. Much has been written about the adoption of AI in banking, but less has been done in the adoption of AI in banking. And what you're seeing is, and this is from a recent BAFT workshop, I've had the privilege to speak at together with Ed Stoltenberg, which is one of the world leaders in the subject from Citigroup, is that the vast majority of the market are still evaluating or thinking about it, but they haven't really adopted and changed their day-to-day processes, workflows, systems, data, and so forth. And some of them are looking at a rule-based approach. Personally, from my experience, I'm not sure that will help you. I think part of the problem is the problem of false positives. Is if you take a rule-based approach to looking at vessels operations, we've seen organizations that get 500 to 1,000 emails per day, and that's just undoable. So some compliance people say, just, you know what, I'd rather not see it because I wouldn't be able to do something with it. So I think the right way to think about it is working with experts like Neil and his team or others, and understanding what does deceptive shipping practices mean? What should I do? How would that influence my workflow, my products, my data, my processes, my talent? And then go after this. And actually, we're expecting most of the market to move in the next 6 to 18 months, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's perfectly clear. And I think reading between the lines of what you're saying, banks still are unsure of how to go about doing this. I think the papers that have been written, OFAC, OFSI guidance, we're seeing more, particularly in the GCC, we're seeing more enforcement actions here. And I think with the more enforcement actions that we see, the more banks will take a proactive approach to actually doing something about this. And it'll be interesting to see these numbers again, if we run this survey again in a year or so. Coming back just to actually deceptive shipping practices, I think it's important to note that they're not new, that they have evolved in the last sort of 7-8 years. Criminals are becoming more sophisticated in order to coordinate these efforts. I mean, you've been involved in the world of maritime for a long time, and particularly this topic, it's something you know a lot about. Can you run us through just the timeline of how this kind of, if we call it like a criminal enterprise, has evolved in the last 6-7 years?
Yeah, so I think if you take a step back, 10 years ago, you had no satellite AIS, so you could not see vessels in open sea. So this is all relatively new, shall we say. So while shipping is one of the oldest professions, but specifically one of the oldest business units in many of the energy companies, for instance, I think in BP is the oldest one, actually, if I remember correctly. I think it's 300 years originally, the shipping team. But data is really new. So I think since 2014, we've seen kind of a cat and mouse game. The fact that everybody could open the screen, look up any vessel in the world and expect to see it is something that in 2010, 2011, 2013, 2014 wasn't as obvious as it is right now. And without getting into too much details, we've seen more types of fraud, if you will. Again, think of it as any type of other fraud you could look at. So from identity changes, which means changing flags and names or ownership, but then the regulator try to play kind of a whack-a-mole game and go after flags that have taken on board vessels, which might not be appropriate. To 2016 was all about dark activity. This means, can I turn off transmissions and disappear? But then navies, such as the Navy I was in, or others, many others, Germany and European and US and UK, patrolling, Syria and Lebanon and the Gulf, started questioning people with VHF, channel 16. Hey, who are you? So people have been taken aback for just turning off transmissions deliberately. So what they do, they've spoofed identity. They would transmit one name and identity, but actually when they're somebody else. And then because the enforcement of flags in 2020 became harder, so we've seen people just hopping between flags every 3 months or 4 months, maybe trying to do it too fast to be caught. And indeed, in 2021, we've seen specifically events like systemic flag manipulation. So it's specific flags. I think most interestingly in GNS tampering, which means tinkering with your GPS locator, or deep dark activity, which means extended period of time. We can see some examples, but the point is I would not expect it to stay this way. I would expect it to keep evolving every year in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, Neil, I'm going to put you on the spot here with a question actually about this and kind of more in your your career and the things that you've done. But we touch here on the evolution of deceptive shipping, and it's the same in any kind of, again, I'll use the term criminal enterprise, where criminals become more sophisticated in their approach. Any comparisons that you can make to this and anything else that you've seen that you come across in outside the world of maritime, where you see tactics to perform illicit behaviors evolve so quickly, and we'll talk about this more, but actually deliberately manipulate technology, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there are too many to mention. The one thing about criminal activity is that you'll find that the bad guys typically tend to move faster than the good guys. So as fast as we can identify, control gaps, then the bad guys are already doing it. So, but when I speak to companies, I'm always trying to get them into the mindset of thinking like the bad guy. So the example that I would give would be cybercrime. If you look at cybercrime, where it first started, the attack vectors were very, very simple, very straightforward, and you can see over the last, even over the last 5 years, how sophisticated it's become, how widespread it's become, how it's jumped up from the IT department right into the boardroom in terms of an important issue. So you will find with any type of criminal activity, they move fairly quickly. They go for the lowest common denominator, the point of least resistance. And it seems to me that the story and the history and the evolution that Ami's just described is following that same pattern, whereby it's getting more and more sophisticated, more organized, and we shouldn't be surprised by that.
Cool. So let's jump in and
Chris, if I may just add one more thing, it's just all about incentives. Bad guys make money. Good guys are usually employed by the government. So sometimes it just takes much more time to move big organizations to the regulation, governments, and then banks and everything, while the bad guys can just do it on a day-by-day basis and find more ways to make money. So I would just say I would think of deceptive shipping practices another systemic net that it's helpful to have in place, and is, although driven by compliance, isn't necessarily relevant only to compliance.
Okay, got it. Good point. Let's move on just to kind of to show some examples of actual deceptive shipping practices. We're mentioning some terms, things that may not be too familiar to some of the audience, things like AIS manipulation, ship-to-ship transfers. We have a specific example that we want to show, and we'll go to that in a moment. Ami, if you want to just talk maybe and run us through kind of the next stage of deceptive shipping practices that we discussed before, and what these guys are actually doing at the moment, and what we're doing to try and mitigate that risk.
For sure. Is that okay if you go on back to the ship-to-ship?
Just sure.
So thank you. So first of all, I'd like to mention that ship-to-ship activity is an absolutely normal, absolutely legal activity. Okay, and it's quite prominent in the Gulf, specifically in Fujairah. So there is no harm in doing ship-to-ship transfers to move cargoes. It's actually quite a known habit. There are regulated areas which are allowed to do ship-to-ship transfers in sea, and people do that just because sometimes the port infrastructure is not as good, or it's just cheaper because you don't pay port taxes. The whole thing is that in some contexts, ship-to-ship is actually used to hide. So it's not just looking for ship-to-ship transfers. It's It's finding the ones who are more interesting. For instance, with vessels who come directly from sanctioned areas or carrying sanctioned cargo and so forth. So it was important to say that, I think, because some of our banking colleagues on this call today aren't necessarily maritime experts, and this could come across as something is bad. It's not bad to do ship to ship. It's just bad to circumvent sanctions when you do ship to ship. So I guess context is king.
I have a question actually. How many STS or ship to ship transfers happen at sea? Do you know roughly in let's say
it's a good question. I don't remember
approximately. We're talking millions, right?
I think it's millions a year.
Yeah.
Although if you look at the bucketing of that, you have people who take bunker fuel from what's called bunker barges, or tanker or fuel from their tankers. So I think you have a lot of these, and you have people, tugboats and service boats coming into the ship to provide provisions or supplies. I think if you look at just cargo, it's not millions. I can come back to you on the specific number. But it's definitely not millions of cargo transfers a year. I think it's probably in the tens of thousands a year, but I can come back to you on that.
Okay. Now the reason for the question is that, for the guys from the banks that are watching, this is an ideal place, as you mentioned, for the needle to hide in the haystack, right? For
sure.
This type of illicit activity to happen, despite the obvious type of things that we're going to talk about in just a minute.
Sure.
So we'll go in and have a look just at the example of the Berlina, Amy.
So a word about the Berlina. If I take a step back, then we've identified this back in May, but since identifying that, we've identified another 220 something events like this around the world that happened in last year or so. So I think it's very simple, and you could see a lot of these articles on the BBC or CNN or some of these. Some of the people who are dealing with sanctioned oil trade have understood that everybody's watching where they're going. So instead of just turning off transmissions, they started to manipulate their transmissions. So while in the zoomed in picture here, you would see a vessel going back and forth, they're not really going back and forth. They've just programmed the coordinates into their transmitters. So it looks like they're going back and forth, while effectively what they're doing is in totally different place, going into Venezuela and picking up oil. So I think it's just we call the illusion of knowledge. It's when you look at a picture on a ship on marinetraffic.com or something like that, you can't really know if that ship is there or not. And I could show you 220 such vessels and events, and you wouldn't even know that they're not there. So I think it's a new phase, because we're used to seeing these pictures and understand them, and your bank could be financing them, or you could be helping one of your clients buy and sell these cargoes, and they wouldn't know, and you can just end up unwittingly financing a sanctions transaction and going to do a deal with the Department of Justice, who's going to take a lot of your management and a lot of your personal reputation for that. So, and this has been evolving, but it's been, actually, we've seen it's growing. We're talking about hundreds of such events, not single ones. And actually, if we map this a bit more deeply, then you see there's actually a specific company with like 8 or 9 vessels that are constantly doing it. So in other words, somebody set up a company to do it, and they just did this type of imports and exports from Venezuela. And I would expect to see more and more of these methods. So the good thing, the practical thing to do about it is ask, is what I'm using covering this? Go, look to your right side, ask your chief analyst or chief compliance officer or head of regulation or whatever the name is, and say, hey, are we covering deceptive shipping practices and specifically GNS manipulation? If the answer is yes, great. Can I see a report what that means? If the answer is no, okay, how can I understand how big the problem is? And how do we do that on a global scale? And you could start with something as simple as one user for one person to look at high risk transactions. You don't need to change all the world in one, 0 to 100. You can do that gradually. It's quite simple.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'm gonna ask Neil about this, because both of us are based in the GCC, we see and hear a lot of news coverage here about companies that are based here that appear in the press for the wrong reasons, and you often see enforcement action against local companies here. by OFAC. I think it's important to note that this is a kind of a coordinated effort. You can see from what we're talking about, what you're talking about, at least, Ami, that there are companies connected to many vessels, with one vessel performing something that it shouldn't be doing. So Neil, just I'll give the floor to you and ask you the question just about, illicit behavior happens. We know that there's a lot of examples here in the GCC of companies becoming sanctioned. Banks, we know, play a very important part in the process of financing the movement of these goods. Do you think that banks can do more or less to combat this type of behavior, and how could they go about doing it?
Yeah, I do think they can do more. It's a general theme. So if you look at the general thrust of direction coming from the communications from regulators and industry bodies. So you've got the DCEO letter from the FCA a few weeks ago. You've got the Wolfsburg Group, you've got FATF, you've got the ICC, etc., etc. Everyone's moving in the same direction. So what I think that banks can do more of. I mean, they are by and large good at KYC and CDD. They've been doing it for a number of years. They know what they need to do to comply with the regulation and legislation. That same approach needs to be applied to vessels. And yes, they should be using technology to do some of the heavy lifting. And again, that's a theme that's been echoed by FATF in particular, is to use more and more technology. So that industry effort is pushing in the one direction. I mean, the other area where I think that banks and insurers can do more is on the almost like the periodic revisiting, the ongoing monitoring, if you like, of the status of vessels. So at the end of last week, the British government published its first ever risk assessment on proliferation financing, and gave several examples actually of vessel-related case studies. One was for a reinsurer who had essentially provided cover to a subsidiary, who then provided cover to another insurer in that country, who insured a vessel which was subsequently designated by the UN. In that particular case, they were fortunate enough to have been notified by the regulator that the vessel was designated, and hence they were able to avoid any violations. But if they hadn't have identified that, then they could have been looking at a whole world of pain in terms of regulatory breaches for that particular violation. So yeah, banks, insurers, financial services organizations can do a lot more, but it's going to take some time for them to get there, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I'm going to just flick back to a couple of slides that we skipped past earlier, just around the letter that came out last week, from the joint letter from the FCA and the PRA in the UK. Whoever wants to answer this question first, Neil, do you think this is the sign of more to come? Do you think that this is a sign that banks are now, or that the regulators in the UK or even Europe, North America, Asia will start to put on more pressure around trade finance, trade related topics?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, it's already been happening. There's a increasing focus on trade finance and financial crime related to trade. So it's not going away. It's only going to get worse. And being able to get timely and ongoing intelligence on vessels is a big part of that.
Okay. Sorry, Ami, I think I interrupted you, did I? No, all is good. Okay, good. So we have around 10 or 15 minutes left. I'm going to keep a few minutes just for questions towards the end. So we're just to recap kind of what we've gone through. We've talked about what the deceptive shipping practices actually are. We're talking about their implications aside from sanctions risk around money laundering, fraud, terrorist financing, potentially monitoring vessels being the tip of the iceberg. And understanding the vessel and the associated risk with the vessels can help solve a lot of problems. We've talked about the role of technology, artificial intelligence. We've talked about false positives, all of which are the challenges which many of the financial institutions face. Neil, if I ask you, as someone who works with a lot of banks in the region, kind of two questions. What do you see as the main challenge for banks in the GCC? And how would you suggest that they go about tackling the problem of understanding vessel and maritime risk?
Yeah, so the first part of your question.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Neil.
Is that better?
Can you try now again?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, the first part of your question in terms of the main challenge for banks in this region, there's a lot of practical challenges. If you look at the majority of the banks that I speak to, they all have KYC programs that are running behind. They have backlogs, they have sanctions alerts, building up. A lot of them are doing remediation. There's a lot of changes of requirements. So the banks are running very, very fast just to almost keep up. The fact that they're now going to be required by industry bodies and regulators to put more effort into focusing on trade and vessels, etc., will just add to that challenge. Hence, they really need to start to embrace technology. That's the way to do it. You can't do this stuff manually, particularly with vessels where you have multiple data sources. You have to correlate everything. That requires technology. So that would be my answer. I think the problem that banks will face is that they're very busy in this space already, and to take on another complex topic, they really need to use technology and be smarter about how they conduct their due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we see a lot of when we're talking to banks here. And first of it, the foundation is to understand the challenge that they face, then to address it. But from a technology perspective, and particularly using tools like artificial intelligence, are on the rise. Ami, I'll ask you just a little bit about kind of what you've seen from a global perspective. You're engaging with some of the biggest banks in the world, and your team engages with some of the most forward-thinking banks in the world. So what are we seeing in the industry to tackle this problem?
Yeah, first of all, I think this is still something that a lot of the industry is processing. I would say quite directly, a lot of people have something in place and they're not sure if that something is good enough or not. It's usually not, but no bank wants to be not uncompliant, right, or non-compliant. It's just not a thing. So I think a lot of the people are trying to understand what to do. We've seen some of the biggest banks in the world try to build their own cognitive AI platforms. We're working with some of them on that. But that's a very heavy lifting. This could be a project of millions of dollars, at least about 10 plus, because that's the level of effort that these guys are putting in, because they're looking at 1 million transactions a year. Having said that, I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how they can start small and grow with it. So how we can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 users in their headquarters or in their key most, let's call it, high risk areas. And by the way, the GCC is absolutely one of them, just because of the close proximity to Iran. So it just is, right? And start building small and growing from there. So I think that's all the rage as far as I can understand. And also because a lot of the banks, Neil mentioned it, are looking at ESG and carbon emissions. And whether you're a ship finance bank or a trade finance bank, you'll need to deal with this in the next 3 or 4 years. So it's probably a good idea to start using AI for deceptive shipping practices and start moving forward from legacy data vendors into something that brings AI to your day-to-day work, because it's going to come for ESG. So it's just a journey. And if you don't do that, you stay behind. One last note is, As people use more and more open accounts, the level of risk in open accounts is much higher than it is in traditional trade finance. So, so that should absolutely be taken into account wherever you invest that, whether it's in the pre-finance stage or in the trade operations floor, you probably, or in the investigation escalation level, one of them is probably a good idea to start with.
I agree, and the common theme that I get from both you and Neil is that it doesn't need to be complicated. The use of tools are there to help. The challenge with a lot of the organizations that you go to talk to about these tools is that they don't know where to start. And I think what you mentioned, Amy, is just start with something, and start doing something. That's better than doing nothing. Neil, I have a question actually that has come to us here, and it's specifically on this topic around tools for monitoring vessels and generally in compliance. Do you in what you're doing in investigations in your practice, tools alone are sufficient to fight this? Do you see other challenges, whether it be with training or culture?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the in the regulated sector, the culture is very important. Having a strong compliance culture, absolutely key. Also, training, awareness, and it's been interesting because we've been talking quite a lot about banks and organisations not quite having the depth of knowledge around about this entire topic. So that for me, there's definitely a awareness raising exercise that needs to go on, and also having knowledge and skills within your organisation that can start to interpret the information that the tools and the output from the tools as well. So there's no point having a whole lot of data coming out of a technology solution if you can't actually interpret it and make sense of it and then action off the back of that interpretation. So I think there's a number of pieces that need to come together. Technology is one of the important ones, but so is the skills and the people.
Sounds good. And we have time for one more question. I'm going to actually pick this one, and I'll give it to Amy. So, Amy, this question, it looks like it's related to the evolution of deceptive shipping practices. It's very simply, how do banks stay ahead of the curve? And I'm assuming that relates to ahead of deceptive shipping practices and what we talked about earlier around where this will lead to with what happens next.
Yeah, I think that my best answer is working with like-minded people who are passionate about this. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that you can buy, but you don't stay ahead of the game by buying stuff. You stay ahead of the game by partnering with market leaders, whether it's in decarbonization or on sanctions, deceptive shipping practices. The way to do it is find people you trust, which put their best foot forward, and invest in constantly building, or else you'll find yourself with 20-year-old technology. And I think there are many examples like that in the market. So I think that's my best answer. It needs to come from the top. And actually, it's quite natural. I don't think anybody who is, and Chris and I spent time together with market leaders in the GCC. Every one of the people we've met is world class, and many of them, I think Neil as well, came from some of the biggest organizations in the world, from HSBC or from EY or from Citibank or all these places, and oftentimes doing that in the headquarters in London or in Hong Kong, and then coming to Dubai to run that. So they're all market leaders, and they want to work with people at their level. So just don't settle for mediocrity, even if it's there in the organization. Make your mark. That's it. Wise words.
So we're running short of time, actually. I think it's on that note, Amy, it's a good note to wrap up on. Thank you, Neil. We appreciate your input. Very valuable. I know our viewers will find it very, very interesting. Amy, thank you very much. Insight was great. again, everyone will find it interesting. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We look forward to. Okay, thanks.
Have a good one.
Bye bye.